Tonight, the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, is suggesting a shift in the way that governments are handling gender-based violence. We'll get her thoughts in a moment. She joins us from New York. Also part of the conversation tonight is Anne Shongwe, who is the UN Women's representative in South Africa. Let me thank you both for your time. I suppose on a global level, Phumzile, you are the one that in many ways is helping represent the voices of women, but also giving direction to many countries who are part of the UN system in terms of what needs to inform policies. How unique is the South African situation to what you're observing elsewhere in the world when it comes to gender-based violence?
Well, unfortunately, it is not unique, Kathy. This is the saddest thing. This pandemic, like corona, is everywhere. And there are few but important steps that have been taken in some situations in countries that have seen the reduction of the pandemic, of femicide in particular. One thing is consistency. We have to stay with the issue and not stop and start depending on whether there's a high-profile case. It's actually important also to have someone who commands the fight and stays with the fight at all times. We also need to make sure that we take this battle to men who must be in the forefront of dealing with this issue. It's not fair to expect women to be the ones that are fighting for themselves. Women fighting up for abogogo, for abantwana, for young women, and then the men are bystanders and watching the women battle for other women. It's so not fair.
What are the things, what are the things when you look at these countries where there have been successes that they are consistent in? So it's one thing staying with the issue, but what does that practically mean?
Yeah. Firstly, is a coordinated effort by prosecution. In fact, all the law enforcement and justice institution, your social workers, your activists, the messaging, the media, and in many cases, actually, countries like Nicaragua, India, Ivory Coast, Fiji, where we have seen some glimmers of hope. It's actually the fight was taken at a municipal level where either a mayor or a regional leader just stayed with the focus and pulled together all the other important institutions in society. And those who do not toe the line, they actually are made to account and face consequences.
And let me bring you into this conversation. When it comes then to how South Africa is able to grapple with these issues, you know firsthand what some of the experiences might be. Do you think that there is that level of commitment towards the issue, Ma'am Anne?
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you for this opportunity. You know, Kathy, the saddest thing with this story, as Phumzile is saying, is that there is inconsistency in the response, but there are glimpses of hope. And where we see glimpses of hope is where you see sustained action by men, where they're having serious dialogues, challenging one another's toxicity. We've got examples of, we, for instance, in South Africa, have a partnership with the Catholic Bishops' Conference, where you find men, community agents, who are engaging and interacting with men in taverns, in men's stokvels, and they are really engaging on what it means to be men that are protective, that are progressive, that are non-violent. And what you find is that there really has been a man code that rewards violence in many of the society, in the communities that we find. So unless there is a real consistent and continuous conversation, dialogue, and real challenging of the constructs, of the social norms that perpetuate violence, then we don't see a change. But we are seeing it, but at a real microcosm of society.
Sure.
What we need is the real broad community-based, where ward by ward, you have faith leaders, police, counselors, working together to really fix the issue of social norms and not be diverted by multiple actions, but stay focused on the fact that we have toxicity that needs to be uprooted from that particular community. And we're keeping an eye on this on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. You know, it's one thing to be able to have platforms where people, of course, talk about the issues and perhaps are able to contribute in terms of where they think some of the biggest changes would need to be. It's another for that to translate into tangible results in the form of a reduction in the number of cases that are being registered when it comes to violence against women. Is there any way of telling yet, Ma'am, and if what the success rate or what the impact then of these dialogues is, because one certainly doesn't want a situation where people are just paying lip service to the problem and at the end of the day there's still no results.
You know, there are models that we have seen across the world, and one famous one is called the SASA model, and it's really a model that was born out of HIV responses in Uganda, where in Uganda they found that unless there was real deliberate attempts to change behavior of men and the community to be able to deal with HIV transmission, where people were dying in large numbers in Uganda, if you remember. You may have been a baby, but we remember 20 years ago. And that model has been transferred, and many of us are actually adapting it and basically focusing on this, and there's real results that, and the MRC here in South Africa has actually done studies in the Eastern Cape and in KZN, and there are specific communities where you can see over 24 months real sustained reduction in intimate partner violence. So it is possible to see, and we've actually seen such results. It's happening in multiple countries. It's not just dialogues, Kathy. I mean, maybe I simplified it by saying dialogues. But it's a real program that is saying, let's identify what is driving violence. So if you take it down to your own community, your own village, my street where I live, and you're really trying to identify what is the type of violence that we're seeing, what's the nature of it. Is it violence that is promoted primarily by alcohol? So like in the conversations we were having in taverns, we found that the more that men were engaged with alcohol, the more likely they were to violate, but already many of them were violent to one another anyway. So this was just, a provocation. And so you then focus on that problem and you say, okay, in this particular instance, we're able to identify that there is violence that is linked to a particular behavior. For instance, we've been talking to some of the men in partnership with Edith Labantu in Cape Town who are working with men who run these circumcision programs, and they're really basically saying, how do we start changing the behavior so that young men are not emerging from these initiation programs with violent behavior. So it's very targeted. You have to understand what is the drive of the violence and then deal with that over a sustained period of time. And as we were saying, women have been having these conversations for years, but men are not having the conversations with one another. This morning we were talking to faith-based organizations, and one of the big things that they themselves are saying, they know street by street who is violent in our streets, who is perpetuating violence. And the thing is to actually start doing work on them. Men needing trauma counseling because of their own behavior. Women needing the kind of support that they need to make sure that their own livelihoods are sorted out so that they have the options that they need. So it's a sustained program, but it is ward by ward, street by street. It is not something that we just discuss superficially. The marches are helpful if, in fact, you're dealing with a specific case. We had clergy marching in Klerksdorp because we understood that there was a case that was unresolved, and they marched until that case was resolved, and the violator was identified and taken to court. And they walked through the entire process until he went to court and is now behind bars. So there, we use different tactics at different points. It is possible to do. South Africa's National Strategic Plan really emphasizes this. And it is possible to do if we just stay sustained on this.
All right. Phumzile, let me bring you back into this conversation. When you look at the interventions that we're looking at here, some of which have been touched on from a local level, how does this compare with what other countries are doing? And let's also speak about the aggressive nature with which many of these policies are implemented.
Well, we could use more intensity in South Africa and consistency. We could also use more men in the forefront of the engagement, and men in society and men in institutions that are influential in society. Of the 20-odd countries where we've seen promising best practice, that is one common denominator. You actually have men in the center of the engagement, from husband schools in Turkey, where abusive fathers and husbands actually go through a process with their families, and they take responsibility, and they are monitored by their own children for change. In Nicaragua, where after 3 years we began to see the numbers going down, and they have stayed down. It flares now and again, but it certainly went down and has stayed down. In India, the station commander was in charge, and he was going to come to your house if you were not complying. In Malawi, it's the traditional chiefs that are leading the chant. In particular, in Malawi, they are also looking at ending child marriage. The chiefs will fine you, will follow up, will go to the magistrate, and will make sure that every step is taken until the perpetrator is behind bars. If a child has been married illegally, the chief will go and get the child, bring them back. So we have now children who are survivors of child marriage, and the community then celebrates this by taking these children to school. So it is known in the community now that this is just not something you do, because the whole community will gang up against you. We don't have that level of commitment that is organized, that is intense, and that is consistent in South Africa. And the media does not report enough. It's on, off, on, off. It happens all the time. Report about it all the time.
It's interesting because you single out the role of power men in particular, men who are leaders in society, and how they can specifically be partners in this fight. I wonder, what are the kind of things that they could be doing differently? So perhaps give us a scenario where the situation may be different to what it is right now.
Well, obviously they have the voices, and I am very encouraged to see what is happening, for instance, in faith-based organization, that you actually had the leaders of the church coming together to chant a way forward. They need the support of their congregants and communities to stay with this. They also need to be helped to have the resources to dedicate people who are going to follow this up, because otherwise we part-time at this thing. It really has to be time to be done on a full-time basis. So it's what they say on Sunday to their congregants. It's what they say when they are talking to Amadodana. It's what they say also, obviously, to encourage even the Mothers Union and others to actually make sure that they too preach the same message to their sons. It's also cultural leaders taking the same stance. When they call Inkundla to engage with the community, it should be that they are the first ones to say this is unacceptable in my area. So the same things that we do for the things that we care about when we are leaders, where we call people, where we follow up, where we agree on what is to be done in a particular community, has to be done in this case, so that people are not in any doubts about where leaders stand. And I just want to encourage those who are standing up and encourage more men. And you don't have to be a leader to do this. We actually need numbers because there's strength in numbers and seeing more people. Let's not ask women to do anything anymore. Really, women have done everything.